for a year.
Oh, wow.
But they, you know, it's like you get together and you meet other fellows and you're part of this group.
Wow.
And
That's amazing.
it's an amazing country. And I got mine with Dan Dick in population ecology. That's how I learned population ecology. But it was really, and I kind of feel like you were stuck with like what you do and what you want to do, and just kind of and they need more like disease people, like they have a lot of these like spatially just kind of like more landscape.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah. The applications are just due, so by next year. And you can apply up to 5 years once you've got your PhD. So you can go do stuff and then apply again. I think unless they change the rules.
Great. Well, it looks like it's showtime.
Just
No, I'm sorry. So that was effective at the state to be presented.
Hello? Can people hear me? Okay.
Can you do a test?
Hi, can you hear me?
Like into like so many different.
That's the only reason I was
Okay. Hello, welcome to Science on Tap, and we're going to get started. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Myra Finkelstein, who is a professor in the Microbiology and Environmental Toxicology Department at UC Santa Cruz. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about herself. Hi, thanks. It's fun to be here. I actually haven't been to one of these before, so I'm excited to participate and I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell you about my work. As Tina mentioned, I work in the Microbiology and Environmental Toxicology Department at UC Santa Cruz. We'll just get into it. So the work I'm going to talk to you about today is some of my research program, and it's highly collaborative. So I just wanted to point out that I work closely with multiple people, and so the research that I'm presenting is again, collaborative effort. One of my main collaborators is Dr. Vicki Bucker at the Montana State University, but I also work closely with biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and NGOs such as the Nature Conservancy and the Ventana Wildlife Society. So my research is designed specifically to try to use science to help vulnerable species. And the way I do this is I first quantify impacts to individuals, then I extrapolate that impact to populations, and then identify solutions to help mitigate those threats. Because for me, just identifying the problem isn't really enough. We have to try to help identify solutions to do something about the problem that we find. So in my work, I've worked with Lacian and black-footed albatross, which you see here, California condors, which I'm going to highlight and talk about today, and I'm also starting a project working with golden eagles. Is the volume okay on the mic? Okay.
Does anybody want to? I can hear you back here.
We didn't turn it on. I didn't turn it on. Is that right? Okay.
I think it's okay.
So if you have an individual, the one thing if you think about is wild species are exposed to multiple threats. This poor little guy is exposed to people just directly killing it, pollution impacting it, maybe its habitat gets altered, its nesting tree gets chopped down, or it's being impacted by an invasive species. So when we think about effects to wild species, we need to really understand that typically there's more than just one effect out there. But today I'm primarily going to talk to you about pollution because that's my area of expertise and how pollution impacts this little guy and can affect survival and reproduction, which ultimately impacts population health. And if you care about conservation and maintaining populations for the future, you need to worry about population health. So I'm going to talk to you about California condors today. They are North America's largest terrestrial bird with a wingspan of about 3 meters, 9 feet. They can weigh 9 kilograms. They're long-lived. They're believed to live to about 70 years. They start breeding a little bit late in life, about 6 years, and they have something we call low reproduction because they only have one chick about every 2 years. They can't produce more than one chick a year. So California condors have declined dramatically over the past 200 years. And you see here in gray is sort of the area on the northwestern coast, which basically was in the end of the 1800s, estimated to be about 600 condors left in the world. But then by 1982, the number had dropped to 22 condors, just in that little kind of red U shape down in Southern California. So it's not surprising then when I tell you that California condors are still considered one of the world's rarest birds. They've been under federal protection in the United States since the 1970s, and by the International Union of Conservation Nature has listed them as critically endangered, which is their most highly endangered status since 1994. So because the condor population was dramatically, plummeting towards extinction, people started a captive breeding program in the 1980s, and this here is a picture of incredibly cute condor chick being puppet reared by a puppet in the captive breeding program. By 1987, because so many of these last remaining wild condors were dying in the wild, they made the decision to bring all wild condors into captivity. So between 1987 and 1992, there were no wild condors free-flying anywhere in the world, California condors. But in 1992, the first releases of these captive reared birds began in the wild in California. So California condors are actually doing pretty well. The total population at the end of last year, they give yearly kind of counts, was 435 birds, and that combined both in the zoos and in the wild, which is a lot if you think about they were down to 22 birds in the 1980s. So in the wild, condors are released from 5 main release sites, 3 in California, Pinnacles National Park, and Big Sur with the Ventana Wildlife Society, and also down south in Bitter Creek. They were released in Arizona and Baja California, Mexico. And the data I'm going to talk to you about today is primarily from condors in the California population, so from these 3 release sites in California. So on the y-axis here, just number of birds in the free-flying population, which is what we also call wild. But as you'll see throughout my talk, they're not necessarily wild birds, so we also call them free-flying because they're so highly managed. On the x-axis is year, and you can see here the number of birds has increased dramatically from when they started to release in 1992 until 2013, which is when my data series ends here. So that looks great, and California condor recovery has been touted as one of the successes, conservation successes of our time, which is, it's amazing. But if you look at the data closely, the wild population increase is driven primarily by these captive reared releases. So people are really good at breeding condors in captivity and releasing them to the wild, and when they're in the wild, they're not living. So if you look at the red line here, that's the cumulative number of condors that have died or been removed for behavioral problems. And the blue dotted line underneath it is wild fledges. And you can see here clearly that the red line is way bigger than the blue line, which is not a good thing because that basically means that more condors die than are born in the wild, and the population is not self-sustainable. So why? Well, in the 1970s was the first documentation that we had that condors had high lead in their bone. And in the 1980s was the first lead-related condor death was identified. So lead poisoning was believed to be a problem for the number of birds that were dying in the wild. So then using my framework, looking at how lead affects individual survival, reproduction, and population health, quantifying impacts, extrapolating to populations, and then identifying solutions. And first, talk about quantifying impacts. So condors, as I said, are highly monitored. You can see here, every single condor wears a tag, and they have transmitters on them. And condor biologists go out every single day and try to track down every single free-flying condor and see where it is. About twice a year, every free-flying condor in California they try to trap it and check it to see whether or not it has a high blood lead, and look for other health problems and check radio transmitters, etc. But if during these days when they're tracking the condor, it sort of experiences odd behavior, so maybe it's hanging out for too long in one certain spot, then what they'll do is they'll target that bird for trap-up, and they'll go and trap the bird, and then give it a health check and take a blood sample to see if it has high lead. So for condors, actually similar to children, if they have a blood lead greater than 35 micrograms per deciliter, that triggers typically where they receive clinical treatment, which involves something called chelation therapy. And chelation therapy, again, is akin to what we would give a child that has lead poisoning. It's a drug that helps remove the lead from the bird's blood. And it's not a great, it not only removes the lead, but also removes things the birds need. So it involves hospitalization, typically multiple weeks and sometimes months of hospitalization and care if the bird is lead poisoned. But because these birds are monitored so closely and they'll typically have their blood lead checked twice a year, we have a lot of data on blood lead on condors. So we can look at that. So on the y-axis is the percent of the population that's lead poisoned. And here lead poison means they have a blood lead that would warrant them receiving clinical treatment, chelation therapy. On the x-axis is year. And you can see here throughout the years that a large proportion of the population are lead poisoned. And astonishingly, 20% out of all condors tested per year need clinical treatment. So that means if they have a trap-up and they get 10 birds in their trap-up, 2 need treatment for lead poisoning. It's an astounding number. It's of epidemic proportions. But to me personally, what's even more astounding is that if you look at all the condors flying in California, 60% of the wild birds out there have had blood lead that would basically warrant them needing treatment for lead poisoning. So if you go to Big Sur and you happen to be lucky enough to see 10 birds, most likely 6 of them have had to be treated for lead poisoning. A huge number. So what does that mean for the bird? So this is a flight pen where they basically bait the condors and bring them in for trap up. So they trap them in these flight pens. Then they grab them and they take a blood sample and do a health check. Gently. These are very good biologists. They work really hard with these birds. But if the bird is lead poisoned, they're put in a modified dog kennel and they're transported to the nearest zoo facility. For the birds in Central California, that's now the Oakland Zoo. It used to, but for the birds in Southern California, it's the LA Zoo. So it's a large ordeal. So then here's the condor. This is actually 286 at the zoo, receiving treatment. And as I said earlier, treatment can span weeks to months depending on the severity of the lead poisoning. And sometimes the bird makes it and sometimes they don't. But I do want to reiterate how amazing the condor biologists are, especially the zoo staff that take care of these birds. They go through extraordinary measures. These birds are like in condor ICU when they're lead poisoned to keep them alive. So unfortunately, the data I just talked to you about is off of the blood lead measurements. But our research has shown that the birds actually, feathers show that the lead exposure is much worse than blood monitoring data indicate. And the reason that is because the way lead works in your blood, it really only shows about when you've been exposed within like a 2-week window. But we can look at a feather and we can see a lead exposure history over 4 months, the entire time frame of feather growth. And again, these condors have really large feathers, so we can look at a really long time period of lead exposure. And we figured out that about one piece, we analyzed 2-centimeter sections, equates to about 4 to 5 days of growth. So what does this look like? Well, first let me show what do I do. So I'm in the lab, we measure the feather, cut them into sections, weigh the feather, clean the feather, digest the feather in concentrated nitric acid, do other various preps of the feather before we run it on an instrument, which is an inductively coupled mass spectrometer to measure feather lead. So now we have our data. And on the y-axis is estimated blood lead, so we've estimated that from feather lead. We've calculated what about the conversion would be. And on the y-axis is a time scale of this bird. So this bird, these feathers actually, there's 2 feathers, one with circles, one with triangles, that represent the whole time span this bird was alive in the wild. The bird was released in January and died in July. And each peak here you see is a discrete lead exposure event. So you can see here why the blood is not a very good indicator, because the feather shows is basically incorporating what was seen in the blood when the feather was growing, and the feather goes up and then it goes down, it gets exposed to another very high, which was probably the lethal exposure for this bird, and then goes down and again and again. So it had 4 exposure events in the 6 months she was in the wild. And this bird actually was trapped once during this time frame and treated, chelated for lead poisoning. But you can see here, only one of the events then was captured. So we think our blood monitoring data greatly underestimates the true magnitude of lead exposure for California condors.
Do you have the plate?
And the thing that gets me about this story with this condor is this is 422, and she was a 3-year-old female when she was released at Pinnacles National Park. She was again released in January, and then in June they couldn't find her transmitter signal anymore, it went missing. So then early July they sent up a spotter plane and they recovered her remains. So if that makes you, first of all, yes, they send up spotter planes to recover the carcasses of these condors, which is amazing. But it was, what got to me is talking to Daniel George, who was head of the Condor program at Pinnacles at the time, said to me, 422, she was different. Basically, when we let her go, she took off. When they release these birds, it's a soft release. They have lots of food, they have lots of water, they have other condors to play with. They have lots of reasons to stay around and sort of be safe. And she's like, I want nothing to do with you. I am a wild condor. And they said she's just like, she flew out of there. And she was poisoned multiple times and dead in 6 months. So to me, that was really sad. Okay, so it's not surprising then when I tell you lead poisoning has been determined the #1 mortality factor for juvenile and adult free-flying condors. So that's the quantifying the impact to individuals, but what about populations? So to understand how lead poisoning is affecting condor populations, I use this tool called population viability analysis. And it's basically just mathematical models that can help you predict the likely future status of a population. And these are very common models used in the field of conservation biology and also for wildlife managers to basically determine how many grizzly bears do you need in Yellowstone to make sure the population will persist in good years and bad years. It basically tells you that if you want to keep loggerhead sea turtles around, you have to do something about their bycatch and shrimp nets, like incorporating these things called turtle excluder devices, TEDs, if you want to save the population. And just saving little turtle hatchlings at beaches is not going to be enough. It tells you how much area you need for the spotted owl to make sure that they can persist in the future, like how much old-growth redwood forest you need for them to survive. So these are the kinds of models that we can use to understand how is lead poisoning affecting the California condor. So for these models, you have to put in some data. So we put in condor performance over the past 20 years. So you put in the annual survivorship of the different individual age classes and the number of fledged young per female. And typically you kind of have averages and you kind of give these estimates, but in condors we actually know who lived and who died and who had a chick and who didn't. So we could use their real data to basically create these models of what they did in the wild over the last 20 years. We also looked at 3 different scenarios, and in all these scenarios we assumed no more future releases, so we kept it kind of more of a closed population. So we just said, okay, let's stop releasing birds and see what happens in the future. And we'll say, we'll first say we do everything we do now for condors. We'll continue managing for lead. We continue testing them to see if they have high blood lead, and if they do, we'll treat them. We do everything we do every single day. And then we say, well, let's say we stop doing that, and some of these birds with high blood lead then start dying out of the population. And then we say, well, we know what proportion of the population has died from lead because the majority of these birds have been, necropsied, and lead has been determined their cause of death. So we can basically say, well, what happens if that proportion of birds no longer die from lead? What's the population going to do? And so on the y-axis is the number of free-flying birds in California, and this is now projecting into the future. And on the x-axis is years in the future. And the first thing to see is if we stop releasing birds and do everything we're doing now, the line is basically flat. So we don't increase the population at all, which is supported and coincides with the earlier data I showed you that more condors die than are born in the wild. It's not sustainable, and the population is not growing. If we stop treating for lead and say that condors that have hit a blood lead that is considered lethal, such as over 100 microgram per deciliter, die, then we see the population quickly drops again, and within 20 years, you're back to where you started with less than 20 birds in the wild. But on the other hand, if you actually say, okay, we don't have any more lead deaths for the population, it looks like the population can be self-sustaining and can increase in the wild, which was really encouraging. So, what do we do about it? Let's identify solutions. So, solutions for reducing lead-related mortality. First, we need to identify the exposure source, and then we need to eliminate or reduce the exposure source. Sounds pretty straightforward. So for lead is really great, actually, because you can use isotopic analysis to help identify the source of lead exposure. And you can do this because lead exists in 4 stable isotopes, 204, 206, 207, and 208. And the lead signatures in an organism reflect the lead signatures in the source. And so isotopic fingerprinting of lead has been used for decades to understand the sources of childhood lead poisoning. So if a child becomes lead poisoned, then a team will go in and take paint from a windowsill, dirt from the backyard, dust off the back porch, and look at the isotopic signature of lead in those items and the isotopic signature of lead in the child's blood, and identify or greatly point to the thing that was the source of exposure to the child. But it requires very sophisticated techniques. You need to use trace metal cleaning techniques. So we're in a clean lab that has all filtered air because you have to make sure you don't introduce any external lead contamination into your sample, because you have to have very precise measurements of these different isotopes of lead. And so then again, you have to have highly sensitive measurements of these different isotopes of lead. So I've done this work actually before for Laysan albatross who breed on Midway Atoll, and they were poisoned by ingesting paint from old military buildings, and was able to use isotopic analysis to demonstrate that the Laysan albatross were poisoned by the paint, and then from that work, they've gone through, now they're remediating the paint on Midway Atoll. So it's a useful technique to be able to do this. And they're cute chicks too, these snail traps. So we know condors ingest spent lead ammunition. So when condors are lead poisoned and they go to the zoo for clinical treatment, one of the first things the zoo will do is radiograph the bird and see if they have any lead item inside their GI tract. And this is a radiograph of Condor 401 that had ingested a lead buckshot. And you can see the lead buckshot clearly in this radiograph. So we know condors ingest spent lead ammunition. This is a little harder to see, but it's Condor 303, and you can see in the circle there a little kind of light, a lead fragment. This is a tiny little lead fragment that we think most likely is from lead ammunition. And you might ask, well, how can that tiny lead fragment be from lead ammunition? Well, here's a radiograph of a coyote shot with a rifle of lead ammunition, and you can see this scatter shot of all those little tiny little pieces of lead. So if a condor or any other animal or a human ingests one of those tiny little fragments, they can get elevated blood lead, and in the case of this condor, this elevated lead killed the bird. So it doesn't take very much. Even very small little fragments will be enough to poison and potentially kill a condor. So what we can do then on the y-axis is the lead ratio. So I'm just showing you this ratio of lead. So it's kind of like a fingerprint, but not as precise, of the lead item for this Condor 401 with the buckshot and the blood at the time the bird was poisoned. And you can see here those bars are exactly the same. There's no measurable difference, we call between the isotopic signature of the lead in the lead item that was inside the bird and the lead in the bird's blood, illustrating that that was probably the source of poisoning. Which makes sense, the bird ate the lead shot, right? So we've been able to, in 6 different cases, recover lead item that was inside the bird, and every single time that lead item was isotopically not measurably different than the lead in the blood of the bird. But I just wanted to point out here too that the different items are measurably different from each other. So the instrument precision is allowing us to say that the object, for example, from 400 is different than the object from 401. So we have that type of precision, but we know that the blood of 400 matches the object that was found inside the bird. But this is 6 cases, because even though condors are really highly managed, and they do a lot when they have them to care for them, it isn't very common that you actually recover the lead item that poisoned the bird. So to sort of look at this at a larger scale, we looked at a larger sample of condor blood and ammunition samples. We looked at birds that we call pre-release, so before they were ever put in the wild, to get an idea of what a bird's blood lead looked like before they'd been released in the wild. We call that background. And again, our instruments are so sensitive that I could be able to hopefully not find too high blood lead levels, but take your samples of your blood and look at the isotopic signature of lead in your blood, because our instruments are that precise. We also looked at wild condors. We looked at a sample of lead-based ammunition that we got through hunter exchange programs, where people would give us their lead ammo and they got non-lead ammo back in return. And also that was purchased at local sporting goods stores. And then some quantitative modeling to assess the relationship between the lead and the data of the blood lead and the ammunition. So on the y-axis, again, it's just this ratio. And you can just think of it as kind of like the lead signature in the item. On the x-axis is log blood lead, so it's blood lead, but it's log scale. So here are the pre-release birds in green. And I just want to show you they're all low. They're all less than 10 microgram per deciliter, which is what you would expect. And they all kind of fall in this sort of range of a lead signature, which is similar to what you'd see kind of in background in California. So if you looked at the lead signature of, for example, moss on a tombstone, in the cemetery, it would look kind of like that. It's sort of our background lead in California signature. And in comparison, this is the ammo, and it has a pretty large range in isotopic signatures, which isn't surprising because this is sort of a smattering of lots of different samples. But the one thing that's important to note is that the background and the ammo are by and large different. And so there's not overlap between the background and the ammo samples. And these are all wild birds. And looking at the wild birds, they have some low birds, some high birds. But if you look at the scale, most wild birds fall between background and ammo. And as the wild birds tend to have higher blood lead, they tend to look more and more like ammunition. So starting kind of with low, looking more like background, as they get higher and higher, looking more like the ammo. So using quantitative modeling, we were able to show that lead in 80% of the wild birds, the lead signature is best explained by the lead signature of ammunition. And with this concluding that ammunition is the principal source of lead to condors. So who wants to know what those 5 little orange spots are up there? Yeah. So this is interesting actually, and I think this proves the usefulness of this technique. So these 5 birds are pinnacle birds, and we got a call from Pinnacles because they were worried that birds were hanging out these old fire watch towers and kind of playing with paint. And lo and behold, they sent us paint samples, and those 5 birds were lead poisoned, we think, by the paint from these old fire watch towers. But through our work, Pinnacles was able to quickly, within the year, remediate these watchtowers, so this is no longer a source of lead for these birds. And out of all the birds that we sampled, it was just small sub-samples, just 5 of the birds had this signature. So what about trash? So trash is brought up a little bit about condors. Condors eat trash like other birds, like albatross, unfortunately. And it is actually the most important mortality factor for condor chicks is trash ingestion and complications from trash ingestion. And so some things that people have said to us multiple times over the years is, what about trash? They're probably getting lead from eating trash. So we looked at that. A lot of nests in Southern California are monitored for trash to reduce the impact of trash ingestion on the chicks. And so they go in every set amount of days and they clean the nest up of any trash. They check the chicks for signs of trash impaction. And if the chick has trash in its gut, the chick will be transported out and sometimes undergoes surgery. And so we've recovered trash from around the nests of condors and also inside of the chicks to look at whether or not there could be a source of lead. And weird things, like that light bulb filament, have been recovered from inside of a condor chick. That's strange. Okay. And glass and other things. So we looked at about 1,400 trash items that were collected over 6 years in Southern California from condor nests. And first of all, sorted the items into being metal or non-metal. So did they look metal, or were they just like, pieces of wood or glass or clearly plastic? Just very obviously metal or non-metal. If they weren't metal, we didn't do any more analysis. If they were metal, we said, could they possibly contain lead or non-lead? So for the non-lead, it had to have been something like this, bottle caps, which are one of the main kind of metal items that we found in the trash, but we knew that those weren't lead. So of the possibly containing lead, there were 71 items that went for elemental analysis to see if they had lead. So we found from this that 27 of these items, we call them lead containing because they had enough lead in them to be potentially harmful to a condor. But out of these 27 items, 22 were ammunition related, such as a buckshot, a shotgun shell, jacket bullet, casting, and then 2 unknown, which if anybody has experienced it, it's under debate. We couldn't classify it definitively as ammunition. And then on non-ammunition related, electrical, this piece of scrap metal and this old electrical dial. But if you think about it, out of 1,400 trash items that we looked at, only 3 were lead containing and not ammunition related. So we really feel that trash ingestion is not a major source, or non-ammunition related trash ingestion is not a major lead exposure source to condors. So for summarizing this part, lead exposure, the feathers show that lead exposures are much higher and more frequent than the blood data indicate. That condor populations could be self-sustaining if lead poisoning was greatly reduced or eliminated, and that lead ammunition is the principal source of lead poisoning to condors. Whoops, sorry. So to identify solutions, you could reduce exposure to lead-based ammunition. So how do you do that? Reduce reliance on lead shot carcasses, or reduce the use of lead-based ammunition. So feeding stations are used for managing condors, and so they put them out and it's food provided for them, so we know that it doesn't have lead in it. And people have thought, well, this is a safe kind of food source for condors, maybe we should just keep feeding them more. And so could it be providing protection against lead? So we actually found that condors that are observed at these feeding stations are less likely to be lead poisoned. On the y-axis is the probability a condor is lead poisoned. And on the x-axis below is the proportion of days observed at these feeding stations. And you can see here the more days observed, the curve is down, the lower probability of lead poisoning. And not surprisingly, that also corresponds to higher survival. So the more days observed at feeding stations, the higher the probability the condor has to survive, the condor's higher annual survival probability. So that seems like a good idea. Except for, we found that as the wild population has been increasing, condors are spending less and less time at their feeding stations. They don't want to be there. On the y-axis is proportion of days at feeding station here, and x-axis is the number of individuals present in the citizen, or flock size. And as the flock size has grown, condors just aren't hanging around feeding stations. They want to be like 422. They're out of there. They don't want to kind of hang out. They want to be more like a wild condor. And this data is actually supported by the condor biologist observations. They're saying, yeah, we're not seeing them hanging around the feeding stations. They don't want to stick around as much. So we don't think that increasing the number of feeding stations is an option, because these birds really do have the ability to fly wherever they want, and so they don't want to hang around, they're not gonna. There has been some legislation in 2008, AB 821 was introduced to restrict the use of lead ammunition in condor habitat. So what about that? Well, one thing that is we've calculated that even a very few carcasses with lead on the landscape can be a big problem for condors. So on the y-axis again is the annual probability of lead exposure for a bird, and the x-axis now is percent carcasses with lead. So we think just based on how much a condor needs to eat to survive, condors probably encounter between 75 and 150 carcasses per year. So just mathematically, if 1% of carcasses on the landscape have lead, each condor out there still has a 30 to 50% chance of exposure. And one exposure, again, can kill a bird. But I said condors are supposed to live 70 years, right? They don't breed till 6. These are long-lived species. So if you say over 10 years, if only 0.5% of carcasses on the landscape have lead, a condor has an 85 to 98% chance of exposure over those 10 years. And one carcass can actually expose many condors in a short amount of time. So these are pictures from a feeding station. This is a cow, actually that's staked to the ground. I want you to look at that timestamp here, 2:58, and the condors have started coming in. They're like, oh, the buffet's ready. 2:58, so 3:10, they're all just like, whoa, we're in there. You know, there's 20 plus condors now. 2:50. And by 4:40, the only thing that's left is one of the bones that was staked to the ground. What's up? Yeah. So this is probably why we believe that California condors are still poisoned to the same extent post the 2008 ban. We haven't seen a reduction in lead poisoning rates. And that's why we think that could be one of the causes. So if you look past 2008. So what about marine marine mammals. So condors, actually, people believe that they have been able to survive the megafauna extinctions of the Pleistocene because they started eating marine mammals along the coastal United States. And lead-shot carcasses tend to primarily be terrestrial. I know that there can be some marine mammals that are lead-shot, but in general, gray whales could be a great source of food for condors. And on California beaches each year, you have about 2,000 pinnipeds that again can be a great food source for condors. So maybe this could be a way to help condors have a food source that would be lower in lead contamination. And indeed, our data show that it might be. On the y-axis is again the probability of a bird being lead poisoned. X-axis is this has now been time percent observed on the coast. And birds with the most time on the coast, such as greater than or equal to 75%, have a much lower probability of being lead poisoned. But on the coast now, condors are a top marine scavenger. So in terrestrial systems, it's a pretty short, this is just like a food chain, a very, very simple food chain. But in marine now, condors then become like the top marine scavenger, feeding on marine mammals such as California sea lions. And unfortunately, marine mammals such as California sea lions have high concentrations of contaminants such as DDE that's known to cause eggshell finning in avian species. Now, DDE is the main metabolite or major breakdown product, I should just say, of the agricultural pesticide DDT. And even though it's banned for use in the United States, it's still very present in our marine environment, and California sea lions have very high levels of DDE. And indeed, we found that condors on the coast have high levels of DDE as well. On the y-axis is DDE concentration in condors that breed on the coast and are inland. You can see that condors on the coast have much higher DDE than inland. So is this a problem though? So comparing it to what we know about other avian species, if condors are as sensitive to DDE as peregrine falcons, then one of the condors in our sample might be experiencing eggshell finning. But there's a huge variation in susceptibility documented for avian species. If they're as susceptible as bald eagles or prairie falcons, then a larger proportion of condors might be experiencing eggshell finning from this DDE exposure. And indeed, our simulations have shown that almost 40% of coastal condors have DDE levels related to eggshell finning in bald eagles and prairie falcons. And indeed, our collaborators have published that they've seen eggshell finning and reduced hatching success for their coastal condors that breed along Big Sur. So we do think that this, is a concern that we need to think about and keep track of for condor recovery. So in summary, as the wild population increases, condors are becoming more wild, which is a really good thing, except for that's also seeming to make them more susceptible to encountering carcasses that might be contaminated with lead. And that very few carcasses on the landscape can still be a big problem for condors. If 1% of carcasses have lead, each condor still has a 30 to 50% chance of annual exposure per year. And that reducing the reliances of carcasses reducing a condor's reliance on carcasses with lead is really not a feasible option. Let's see how we can do that. So to summarize the whole thing, you've got lead and quantifying the impact. About 20% of birds tested per year are poisoned, and again, that's from the blood lead, and we think from the feathers that the number is probably much, much higher than that. Extrapolating the populations, lead is preventing population recovery. If we get rid of lead poisoning, condors might be able to be self-sustaining again. Really, the main solution and the only viable solution, I think, is to reduce the use of lead-based ammunition. So one of the things that we do, as I said at the beginning, I work with a lot of partners with different NGOs and management agencies. So we work with these people that co-author our publications to share our results to help inform decisions, such as policymakers in California. One of my main collaborators, Don Smith, and I helped to put together a kind of a policy information about the health risks from lead-based ammunition in the environment. We pulled together a large number of scientists to sign on to this statement, scientific consensus statement, which documented and illustrated the risks of use of lead-based ammunition to wildlife and humans, to help share that to inform policymakers. And then in California in 2013, Jerry Brown signed AB 711, which is basically the first law in any state in the United States. California will be the first state in any state in the United States to ban the use of lead-based ammunition for hunting. And the way that the law is, it's a phase-in, so it goes into full effect in 2018. But we're really encouraged about this law and about the prospect of it reducing lead poisoning to condors, but basically to any scavenging species out there, because this is not just a condor problem. Any animal that eats and feeds on a carcass that has been shot with lead-based ammunition has the potential to ingest a lead fragment, which has the potential to poison or kill that animal, such as mountain lions, bears, red-tailed hawks, golden eagles, turkey vultures, coyotes, anything. I wanted to just show that there's some really good information out there. Hunting with Non-Lead is an organization that's been basically helps to illustrate the different opportunities for the use of non-lead, the availability, the price points, all different kinds of things. And they've really expanded their outreach, especially with the law that's coming into effect in California. And they're a great resource if anybody that you know or if you care about learning more about hunting with non-lead. I strongly encourage you to go to that website. And if you care about watching condors at feeding stations, you can join our citizen science project called Condor Watch, where basically you help us identify condors that are hanging out at the feeding stations so we can understand if there's any social structure to who's hanging out with who and if that increases their likelihood of being lead poisoned. But you also could see a lot of other cool animals at the feeding stations. We see lots of wildlife, not just condors there, feeding on these carcasses. And this is a website, www.condorwatch.org. It's a part of the Zooniverse Citizen Science Project. And lastly, I just wanted to give a shout out for my graduate student who's doing an upcoming event. She's a Weiss Women in Science, and she's giving a naturalist acoustic observation walk on October 7th and 8th. If you're interested, Zika, she's working on condors as well. She's very knowledgeable and she's a great naturalist. And if you are interested in all, I'd encourage you to go. And with that, I'll just thank the funders and my support, photo credits, and take questions. Thank you.
I'd like to mention one thing that I heard. I don't remember the references, but the children of hunters also have high lead levels in their blood. Not just wildlife, children of people who hunt and eat the food that they get with the hunters.
Yes, that's a good point. And so in our consensus statement, we talk about the research that's been done showing that hunters that use lead ammunition have elevated blood lead. And same with, so people that eat game that has been shot with lead-based ammunition have elevated blood lead. And right now, actually, the CDC says there's no acceptable level of lead exposure for young children that's known to be without long-term detrimental impacts. So it just kind of stands to reason why you wouldn't want to feed your child game that has been shot with lead-based ammunition, in my opinion.
Earlier in your talk, you referred to on a slide population removed. Was it for poor behavior? What's that about?
Yeah, so it could be lots of things. So these birds are highly managed, but at the beginning, also in the 1990s, when they were first releasing them, they were, it's just like a bunch of teenagers out there causing problems. So they were like hanging out at this one place that was like a hang gliding place, and they were hanging out and kind of bugging the hang gliders and supposedly getting into food and like just doing all kinds of stuff. And they'd be ripping, like sometimes they'd go to different housing developments and they'd rip window stripping off of places. And so there's like basically inappropriate interactions with humans would be one thing like that. And then others would just sort of be maybe inappropriate interactions with each other. So you'd have one that was sort of not really, like kind of messing up a pair. Maybe they have a pair, like a condor pair that was trying to establish. And then there's a third oddball out getting in there, kind of causing problems. So they'd sometimes remove that bird. Again, especially more at the beginning when they were really trying to facilitate this. Less so now. It's not as common now that they remove birds for behavioral issues. Sometimes, but now they also know better. They kind of have better idea of what bird looks like they'll make it before they even go to the release. So out of the birds they breed, some get tagged for release and some stay in the captive breeding program in zoos. So they've also, gotten better with that. Yeah, but some of the old stories are hilarious about what those condors are doing. Yeah.
Are there other like heavy metals that should be thought about when talking about condors? Let us know what are cadmium?
Yeah. So mercury. So methyl mercury is also a contaminant that you see in like marine systems, and we did find that California condors have much higher levels of mercury that we concluded was methyl mercury based on a subset analysis than non-coastal condors. So methyl mercury, because that's again an organic pollutant that you see kind of biomagnify up food webs. There's been a couple of condors, like one condor did die of zinc toxicity. I think they think it was from a micro trash ingestion. But in general, we haven't seen other heavy metals be a big problem. Just a random bird here or there. But methyl mercury for the birds that are on the coast might be a problem. You wouldn't really call it a heavy metal though.
So, is it just from hunters that have left the game that they killed? Or is it like lead left over from them taking the carcass?
So that's a great question. So why? Okay, so it's a lot of things. So it's anything. So it's either somebody shooting a coyote on their property and using lead and just leaving the carcass. Shooting ground squirrels, we think is a problem. It's hunters that might shoot game and then gut the animal but leave the gut pile and in a way that it can either be unburied or exposed. So we have people kind of educate me here, but if a hunter kills a deer, they don't want to haul it all, so they'll gut the animal close to where they killed it and then leave the guts, which can contain the lead fragments in it. Or sometimes people aren't able, like they'll shoot something but they aren't able to recover it because the animal gets away and dies like much later. And so it could be some of that. So it's a whole mix of things. It's predation control, it's varmint control, it's legal hunting, maybe some not legal hunting. It's lots and lots of different things.
So is that why? Have you done any other work to like try to stop any of that stuff, or is it just too many things?
Oh well, so the legislation will ban all hunting, so it should cover basically all of these things. The only thing it won't cover is if somebody needs to like put down their cow or their horse. It won't cover livestock. But that wasn't deemed to be a very big problem because typically that's done with like a headshot. So it's not necessarily, people didn't really think that was going to be as big of a problem. So the legislation, which is coming into effect in 2019, should cover, hopefully, the vast majority of these things. Yeah.
Does it cover air rifles and...
No. Yeah, it doesn't cover sport like air rifles or is that like, yeah, no, it doesn't cover that. And we think the microtrash that we found that was lead related, a lot of that was from like plinking stations where people will go and just shoot signs or whatever, for fun. And then the condors are picking up the trash. So, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, anytime you're putting lead in the environment, it could be that thing.
Does this isotopic model also apply to other scavengers?
Yes, it could. Yeah, it could. I mean, I worked.
Has it been? Or?
Oh, has been. No. Well, I should. Very, very limited. I should say. Very, very limited. But it's the same technique that we used with the lace and albatross. It is a bit tricky because there's there's a lot of different signatures, and so even for our condor model, it's not, it's just you have to use the quantitative modeling. It's not really one for one. If you get the item that was inside the bird, it's a match. But otherwise, you're doing sort of more extrapolations. It's not as precise.
What program or system did you use to write your models? Were they done by scratch by your lab, or did you use a platform that was already existing?
Yeah, so the population models were done in MATLAB.
Okay, thank you.
So the question was about, is there similar efforts in other states and efforts as far as research and efforts to change legislation? There is efforts to try to change legislation or to incorporate legislation in other states. None of it has gotten traction yet. There's a large opposition to restrictions on the use of lead-based ammunition in our country. And some of the work that I'm hoping to kind of accomplish with the Golden Eagle studies to understand sort of what's going on in other states with scavenging species. Yeah, so not yet. We hope.
I had a question, but also I wanted to say that John McCain in Arizona was both in favor of a voluntary ban, and at the same time, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms wanted to ban brass bullets, which were a possible alternative. And so he was trying to talk them out of banning the brass bullets to make it the alternative to instead of lead. Voluntary ban. And then weren't you didn't you have a freedom of information request for your data? Yeah. From possibly from the National Rifle Sport Shooting Association. Yeah, we were actually sued. University was sued. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So there is a voluntary ban in Arizona, in some regions in Arizona, because Arizona does have one of the release sites for California condors. So there is a voluntary ban there, but we haven't seen a reduction in lead poisoning in Arizona yet. We're hopeful that maybe there will be, but there's not been evidence that that's translated into seeing a reduction in lead poisoning yet. And again, I think it might come down to the fact that you don't need a lot of lead to poison a lot of condors.
Is there any way after the law is passed, enough people will keep doing it, even if it is illegal, that it will affect the population?
Well, I'm hoping that there'll be, people will start converting that awareness. So one of the things that I've been told is some of these non-lead alternatives are actually superior ammunition, and some of them have better, like sighting, so you can get better accuracy, and that people really like it. And when they do demonstrations, people like the non-lead. So I'm hoping that everyone recognizes that it's going to take time, but that with education and adopting these other alternatives that are, good products, the prices are coming down, and they're healthier for, hunters as well. We're hoping that will be adopted.
Are there any multiple ways to get the word out? Do you guys have special ways to get the word out for the same ammunition is better?
Yeah, so the website of the Hunting with Non-Lead, they do a lot of outreach. So they go to sporting events, they hold sporting events, they do a lot of outreach. So that's one thing that's also been a good outcome of the legislation and the time lag, is that there's been more resources put into the outreach component. And so there's more people working on it and more places that they're going. So there's a big part of that working. And in fact, California now is talking about doing a large non-lead ammunition kind of giveaway that they might implement. Well, I guess that might go into effect next year at some point. So, hopeful, yeah. Hopefully, seems like it. Yeah.
Has anyone discussed subsidizing the companies producing the non-lead versions to bring the cost down to comparable?
Well, I think I don't know if anybody of importance have discussed it. We've discussed things like that. I think, resources is always a problem. And right now I know that a lot of those resources have gone into purchasing non-lead to help to get hunters to try it out and exchange programs and trying to, expand the exchange programs. just with supply and demand, it seems that there are more non-lead alternatives out there now, and it's available more different types of ammunition for more different types of guns, and that's also bringing the price down. So there's more competition. There's also kinds of things. So it is slowly happening.
We'd like to thank Great Place for providing this venue, and please thank your waitress for their service. And want to let you guys know that October 26th there will be another Science on Tap. Alan Miller, who's talking about holding global warming below 2C with minimum investment, costs, negligible land use area, and acceptable risk. Yeah, it's a really long title, but sounds like he's talking about global warming. And so let's thank Myra again, and if you guys have additional questions, you can try and catch her before she leaves. Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Brett just went to Mount Hamilton this weekend to look at the observatory. And found out that in the summer they do night viewing. So you can go.
What was that?
Mount Hamilton.
So I've done that.
Yeah.
When they used to
The
have
night
music at the
observation.
stairs? Yeah, they used to do that.
It's just hard to get in while there's still tickets.
No, I haven't.
Oh, that's a long time ago. Long time ago.
I didn't go for like fun.
Yeah. Well, you should.
You're sort of like. You gotta get the money.
My guess is that that was actually just one. I think it's just one. She's asking that. I don't know if I've ever seen it. But not like I've never like. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have a guy so tell them and you were
Really? Actually, I started to get sore too.
Yo, you were really close to
oh yes, good. She was like, well, I can't November.
For an 8 a.m. I have to wake up at like, yeah, and you might
And they just went after it.
He doesn't live very far from here.
You got Nathan.
Yeah, with Jessica.
Yeah, we drove. That's why I took